So, hi Ebbe. We've
Hello.
already started the conversation, and this is going to be one of those flipping it conversations because, like, we'll put it on Voices of the Regeneration, but you'll also use it, and this time you're asking me questions, but I might also ask you questions in
Sure.
the process. But nice to connect, and I'm really interested in everything you're doing. So, yeah. So we'll might have to ask you some questions so people can also understand, or maybe you want to say a little bit what organization you're working with and where you're at and what your vision is before we get to
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and thank you for, having this conversation and re responding to my reaching out. So the conversation series that we've been having in Earthways this last year about regeneration, we call them EarthTalks. I mean, the name is not so important, but they're basically we're interested in finding out because we realize that we're a little bit sort of, I mean, regeneration has been really taking off in the last maybe, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years as a concept, to the point where it's in danger of becoming hollowed out as happens. But we are really interested in finding out, what does regeneration mean in terms of learning. We are in the process of establishing the working title, and I think it'll be called the Center for Regenerative Learning. And so these conversations are really about exploring, the regeneration of our inner and outer nature, and how and what regeneration actually means for
Mhm.
us as teachers, or as facilitators, or as workers in this field. And
If you
what
interrupt you so I don't forget, because you said
yeah,
something earlier.
yeah,
Um, one thing, I have a little bit of a trigger response when people call regeneration a concept.
concept, yeah.
So we should talk about that at some point. And the other things, as you said, uh, I actually really love Earth Talks as a name
Mm-hmm.
because what we all are is Earth talking. You,
Right.
me, everybody, but we've forgotten that. So I just both of them felt important. So
Sure.
didn't want to interrupt you.
But I mean, it connects with my first point and my question, because I think what I really value in your work is that you're very good at saying this to people when there is talk about regeneration, that it is not just a concept.
Mhm.
That, if we get in our analytical mind and conceptualize what generation might be, we are already in danger of being a little bit removed from the core of what regeneration is about, because regeneration is also a biological process, is also something which is beyond or before or outside of conceptualization. It's actually just part of how life unfolds, and how organisms do their thing, how they organize, how they develop, how they live and die. And regeneration is, I mean, what happens when we use it as a concept that is supposed to do work for us, conceptual work. We are actually, maybe we lose a little bit of the power. I don't know, or we actually are in danger of going too far away from the core. So my first question to you is, when you just, very broadly speaking, when you hear this term regenerative learning, because there's regenerative agriculture and regenerative economics and leadership and so on, but regenerative learning, what does that mean for you, just broadly speaking?
I'll go there in a sec. For me, the anchoring regeneration as a core process of life is really important. There are even two anchors that I think we need to make every time we speak about this, precisely because it is a new concept for a lot of people that hear it. And the danger is that because of all of us being embedded in a system and the system also behaving us, we're not all systems change agents. We're constantly being changed by the system we're embedded in. and with the current economic system, it leads people to, when they try to take something into the world, to brand it, to make it their own, to make it a lineage that is defended and new, and this is us, and those are the others, and we have a USP, a unique selling point. And it's precisely that energy which often comes from just trying to do good work and protecting it a little bit against copying and by people who don't really understand it yet. And all of it, I completely understood why it comes into the being, but it can then make this conversation about regeneration just another conversation like we had around circular, around integral, around whatever the next one will be, thriving, flourishing. Um, it's just another adjective that a bunch of consultants or trainers in a certain methodology can use for a few years, and then it will just thistle out, and the next thing will come around the corner. And that's even, most people even think of it that way. They say, let's see how long it's going to last. And precisely because of that, if we don't do the first anchor, which is that regeneration is happening in every cell of our body, it's in every ecosystem that we are nested in. It's to call it a concept is like saying respiration is a concept, digestion is a concept on that biological reality level. That's the one thing. And the other thing, equally important, that I had highlighted in the response of people to my book, Designing Regenerative Cultures, is that too many people understood designing or regenerative cultures as this, wow, that's an interesting new concept. I wonder whether we'll ever create that utopia. Sounds nice. We should have it. So it became yet again a future-oriented utopia that we must manifest. Mm-hmm. And that's not what regenerative cultures is. Regenerative cultures is the survival pattern that has made our species survive as regenerative keystone species in the ecosystems that brought us forth for 99% of our species evolutionary journey. What we call history is a little blip where we did things differently. And what we're beginning to learn is that that's not such a good idea. And when I say we, I have to also highlight not we as the global humanity, a small percentage of humanity that created the exploiter cultures that created the unsustainability of our species and changed the pattern from us being dwellers in place, expressions of place, to owners of place that can be manipulated against each other, drawing national boundaries and implanting this concept of nation states to divide and conquer. That's not really our species' core pattern, but we are capable of being regenerative cultures in place, and we have been for most of our species history. So that I just want to highlight that because then we're really talking regeneration. And now finally coming to your question, I really loved it when you contacted me, and I saw also that Pavel and Mona were involved in the Regenerative Learning Network. More and more, like, words really matter, and education is a loaded term. That brings up all sorts of context, and it's also a noun, and it's sort of static. But regenerative learning is a gerund, and therefore it's dynamic, and it's in and of itself, the two, what is regeneration and what is learning, actually mirror each other really. Like you cannot be regenerative if you're not a learning system. Like even every one of those cells I just talked about also has to have the capacity to respond to an environment meaningfully in such a way that it continues its existence. Otherwise, it won't exist. And so this process that, like, I love the term regenerative learning. I think it's at the heart of, you get this quip or a little flimsical statement in English, you live and you learn, otherwise you don't live very long. But it's actually really true. And how do we make learning regenerative is a massive question, because then suddenly education doesn't become absorbing facts or handling facts. It's a process of continued exploration and relationship building between people and place and history and context that is ongoing. And it's actually part of what creates community health, individual health, and planetary health to embed us again as learners. It's part of why our system is so unsustainable, is because we've built everything at a scale that doesn't fit the way nature's scale linking processes work. We've made everything bigger in the chase for efficiency and the economic push there. And so learning and place are actually really deeply related. True learning has to come out of place, like to use regenerative development language and Regenesis Institute language. It has to be place sourced. And I think if learning isn't place sourced, if learning is, and actually real learning is always place and community sourced. It's always in context. Education can be out of context.
Yeah. Yeah, and so you're touching on something that I've been struggling with in English, because education it has several meanings, but you can talk about the educational system, and then education, or the philosophy of education, perhaps. I think we have a better word for that in Danish and in German with Bildung or Dannelse, which is more about these questions. How do we do
It's
things?
more developmental. Bildung is like the how do we shape and give form to a fully functional participant in nested community, the human community and the community of life.
Right.
So
And it also brings in, I mean, because with education, it's just the mental image I get is sort of a school, schooling. But with Bildung or with Danielse, we're actually talking more about what sort of organism are we that learn, and and also the whole other aspect of what is special, if there is anything special about how we human beings learn. Because if you take, for example, I mean, I know that you work closely with Fritjof Capra and been trying to absorb some of his points on this, and he says that any organism that is continually interacting with the environment or is structurally coupled is a learning system.
Yeah.
So learning is embedded in life as a process itself, in the same way that maybe we can say regeneration is. And when you take this perspective, it becomes really interesting to see that we are this organism made of multiple organisms, and then we have also this particular kind of consciousness that we have, and that part of what we are able to is to expand. I mean, we have in Denmark this old, in the folk high school movement where I've been working, this old guy Grundtvig, who basically worked to take the peasants of way back and help them to think of themselves or see themselves as part of a nation or part of a people. And back then that was really, I mean, the peasants had to then see themselves in community with people who maybe spoke German in Denmark or French or a different language and felt very distant. And maybe we can say that that in Denmark, let's take Denmark as an example, that has happened 150 years ago, 200 years ago. In the meantime, we've had human rights, and we started seeing ourselves as part of a humanity. And clearly what is the challenge now is that for our consciousness and our learning is to expand how we see ourselves as part of a much wider community. And we can talk about the community of life itself, or of being part of a planetary community. And I always find that learning is also, instead of talking about education, is a way of helping this to conversation, saying actually it's also about our worldviews, it's about how we see the world, it's about how we are in the world, it's about ontology. And it just anchors, like you say, with regeneration, it anchors the talk of learning, because it's difficult to speak across different worldviews, and in this worldview where, you know, I guess regeneration is a concept that does work, so that we can make a 5-step plan for how to make the world sustainable. That's actually a different worldview, a different ontology from one that sees each of us as embedded, as you say, as Earth talking through us, as being part of a community of life.
Yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of learning through conversations with Bayo Komolafe and Nora Bateson in the last couple of years. And what they really made me much more aware of is how central, like even in my own thinking, this notion of agency is so central in Western thinking. And it's actually relatively new. And of course, we have agency as participants in the system, learning coupled system with the environment. But we've built a whole story of ourselves that we can study a world out there, create lots of quantitative data about that world, and through that predict and control and manipulate that world as if it is a thing that we are doing things to. That is the worldview of separation. That is the worldview of conventional science and technology. But cutting edge science and technology has actually understood that that works for a while, but it runs against the glass ceiling. The world's always more unpredictable than we think, and uncertainty is here to stay. It will no algorithm, no more powerful computer, no new technology will rid us of uncertainty. And complexity science came through mathematics and science to this conclusion quite a while ago. Like even starting with Poincaré's three-body problems and chaos theory, every system that has three interacting variables is a non-linear system that follows a different logic that is circular, like a different causality that is circular and not linear as our invented systems prior to that were. And so we can mathematically prove that beyond a certain time and space frame, the world is fundamentally unpredictable. And that shifts us back into appropriate participation as the goal of science. How can science inform and make the world intelligible enough in its dynamics and inform us what scale we best and how do we link across those scale participate in? Because that's also what you addressed with like the folk high schools and the whole kind of Nordic project that happened 100 years ago through like popular Bildung. How do we form a citizenry? And in many ways, it's probably the reason why you have such an interesting social state in the Scandinavian countries. And on the other hand, the danger is again this like implanting a notion of a nation state too deeply, because that notion is a power over notion. So yeah, for me, coming back to this appropriate participation, in a world that is still in the worldview, or in a society where the center of gravity is still in the separation worldview, then you educate people about this world and how to predict, manipulate, and control it, how to be good managers of that world.
Right.
In a world that has finally become in touch with the reality of the complex nested system that has brought us forth, which is planet Gaia and our solar system and the cosmos, that is so much beyond our capability to predict and control. That system is about appropriate participation, and they're learning the gerund, the understanding that it's an ongoing process that will never end and that will be spiraling. We will come to the same places in our education learning process, and every time we come to them, they will be different because we will be different and the system will be different. And to tie the bow to this rather long monologue is what Bio and Nora made me understand is that it's not just learning about the system, but also learning how to ready oneself in the dynamic of the changes that the system has. And this is particularly relevant to our generations, the ones alive today at the moment. We're not the generation who's going to change the world by being the hero change maker. We have to be the communities that ready themselves in the front of the changes that we now know are coming towards us no matter what. That is multiple collapses on many scales.
Yeah. And I mean, it's sort of one of Bayo Akamalafi's point. I think it's him who said that, part of, how we respond to the crisis is part of the crisis.
My favorite quote by him.
Yeah. And I mean, I was also thinking of Fritjof Capra's point that the different human crises, where the multiple crises that are unfolding between around us is rooted in a crisis of perception. And if we take that as that regenerative learning is also about, it goes down to the level of perception, and then how do we participate, like you say, or how do we respond appropriately? I mean, I think this is to me, this is a really important point about learning and perhaps about regenerative learning, is that we need to what's the right way to say it? We need to work with perception, and we need to work with how what is actually an appropriate response, because we are so often caught in actually just reacting. And if you see that, I think there's a difference between reacting to something and responding to something, and that learning is about basically learning to see the finer details, or deepening perception, or I don't know, maybe I can ask you that. Is regenerative learning a process where we deepen our perception of how nature unfolds, or how life unfolds?
When you use the word perception, it's another one of those loaded terms that will bring for people up what they've been taught in kind of school education a long time ago. And very often perception is misunderstood as a bit of there's a world out there, and we open our eyes and we perceive that world and it's coming in. And for me, learning and regenerative learning is when we precisely don't think of perception in that way, but we pay attention to the organizing ideas that shape how we make sense of what we see when we open our eyes. Sure. Because if you don't have concepts like trees, sun, photosynthesis, soil, looking out what I'm looking out there right now, the forest garden I'm stewarding, looks very different. It's just green and brown bits, like so basically in every act of perception there's an act of conception, and the ability to move onto the second level observer level we actually do have as a species, but our education system has not strengthened that capability, because people who are able to question the way they think and the way their society thinks are much harder to control, to do what you want when you want to build an industrial system, for example. And that's what education and the school you referred to earlier, like, well, comes to mind, these kind of pose of things. That's Victorian England trying to create the cannon fodder of the first industrial revolution. And so the minute you, from an early age on, make people aware that there are multiple worldviews and multiple ways of meaning making, that like, how would science education be different if you used science always in a sort of phenomenological way in place to understand the world, and you also made it clear that it's one way of seeing the world that is extremely useful and should be studied, but there are other ways of making meaning of the world that have fundamentally different percepts than the scientific process, and therefore they're not necessarily commensurable, but they're complementary, which is different ways of knowing, more participatory through sensing, feeling, and intuiting. I find the Jungian four dimensions of knowing are really useful when we talk about learning, and what we call education only focuses in the quadrant that is thinking as a way of knowing, the analytical mind. And sensing, feeling, and intuiting is actually, if you think about it, again, going back to we are regenerative cultures with regard to our heritage, for the large part of that journey that made us human beings, Homo sapiens, a long part of that was pre-verbal. Therefore, it was pre-conceptual. Therefore, thinking was definitely not one of our strengths as much. But sensing, feeling, and intuiting as a participant in a living system, knowing where danger was and where opportunity was how we actually survived for a long time. And now we have an education system that says, oh yeah, that's a little bit woo-woo and we can't quantify it scientifically, so let's just ignore it. So true learning enables people to draw wise action from all four of those dimensions.
Yeah, I really appreciate that point. I mean, it's almost like that development you're describing where, thought, language, I mean, the development of language and then thought grows to the point where it completely overshadows the other three quadrants. And I mean, part of it is just to leave thought alone. I mean, and there's maybe ways to do that. I think, David Bohm and Krishnamurti's conversations and this idea of proprioception or thought awareness, becoming aware of the work that thought does is really important. But also that when you point out that, perception is also a tricky concept, and that maybe we need to talk about attention, that attention, because so I actually developed a course for my students just about attention. So you can be attentive in all these different ways. You can be attentive on your inner world. You can be attentive through your senses. I can be attentive on my pinky finger, although it's a little bit difficult to you can't really split the attention. You can maybe deepen it. If there isn't attention, it doesn't, I mean, if there isn't a shared field of attention, it doesn't really matter what I say, because then the message doesn't come across. And so it's also, I guess, regenerative learning is also about working with the sort of habits and dispositions that take us into the mental realm and where that takes over. And it leads to another question I wanted to put to you, because I can think of many ways that learning is unregenerative. So, I mean, what do we need to? Is it valuable to talk about unlearning as a part of regenerative learning? What role does unlearning these habits and dispositions have if we want to work towards a regenerative learning?
I think it's central. I mean, like everything we just have talked about is something that is very central to the way that Tobias Luthe and I have worked on the series of massive open online courses and the Certificate of Advanced Studies and Masters that we're running through ETH Zurich, which is really an attempt to, at the heart of one of the world's leading science and engineering institutions, have the conversation that doesn't overswing the pendulum, that still maintains, yes, you're brilliant here, you engineers and your scientists. We're not saying that you're not amazing, but your worldview is in and of itself limiting. And because they're brilliant, we're finding that we actually get a lot of people from the universities itself taking this course that we're offering, professors and so on, and their motivation is mainly because it's a course that is talking about uncertainty, that is talking like they've been at the top of their game for so long in engineering and science that they realize that things are unpredictable and uncontrollable, and that more algorithms, more data, more money thrown at a kind of engineering solution isn't going to solve the issue, that it's more systemic. And so that's the bridge that we're trying to build with this course that we're just talking about. How do we value the analytical worldview and what it brings, but how do we actually bring people back into a sort of attentiveness to the world coming into being through the act of participation cognitively? I mean, that is Maturana's and Varela's a theory on autopoiesis and cognitive coupling, that this relationality is actually at the heart of the structure of life and how living beings participate. And so for me, I learned a lot through Goethean science, because Goethe, 200 years ago, saw that we're running, by focusing on a particular thing, like a particular methodology, that science was increasingly getting blind to that second level of observation. It wasn't questioning its own methodology properly. And so Goethe developed his own qualitative science that was much more about the process of attention, and how, like, for example, one thing that you do in Goethean science is you find different ways of accessing a tree in front of you, rather than saying, okay, I've seen birches and now I'm just going to count all the birches that I come across and do a quantitative analysis of how big their stem is and how fast they've grown. That's normal science. Goethe is more like, I really want to understand what a birch is. So I'm going to sit in front of this birch and I'm going to like do all the hard science, find out everything I can study in books about birches. But then I sit in front of one birch and I flip my attention consciously from beholding the whole in context and then putting it back, looking at the detail with focus. And then you train your mind. It's a participatory science of qualities where you actually have to work like a craft at doing this. You train your mind to bring both of those perceptions back together again. And in that process, with your eyes closed, suddenly there is something that the Goetheans and also the Steiner anthroposophy people call the gesture of the birch.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating. Like, to make this a bit more real. I've been a biologist. Like my first degrees in biology and zoology, not so much in botany. So I didn't know that much about plants when I went to Schumacher College to do my master's in holistic science. And then I learned from some of the elders in this, Henry Botoft and Margaret Calhoun. We had a number of sessions, not just weeks, on Goethean science. And doing exactly what I just described with a chestnut, I learned something that I actually didn't know before scientifically, that because when it came to what is the gesture of this tree, I got up and I did a sort of spiral, like I turned and put my branches out. And up to that point, I personally didn't know that there's some trees that grow straight, like very few actually, pine trees, but most trees have a spiraling growth pattern. So I, through this methodology, connected with something in my body that told me something that I could have also read in a book, but I hadn't up to that point. And so it's how do we hold that kind of approach and learning from the world in detail from the phenomena, not as something, oh, that sounds a bit woo-woo, but really honestly explore it as a way of understanding our participation, and at the same time value the more quantitative scientific way of working.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I like the way you're describing this is, I get a sense, because one of the areas that I know that you also have touched on and worked on is health, and how health is also rooted in basically a sense of coherence, and coming into touch or contact with wholeness, and feeling just, I guess it's a sort of a feeling of that things cohere, and that we connect with them, so that when you don't feel connected, or you feel incoherence, can actually give rise to illness, in a sense, right? And I was thinking about this in relation to the question of unlearning. And because one of the things that, and I think it's particularly relevant also in where I'm living at the moment in Denmark, how we deal with our past in a, let's say, sort of in a constructive way, and the way that you're talking about how you're creating a learning environment for engineers, actually telling them you're really great at this. The worldview that you're working within is here, but we actually need to also supplement with something over here. And I feel like there's a tension when we start coming into contact with deeper identity questions with relating to who we are. For example, in Denmark right now, I think there's a growing conversation around our colonial past, and how we need to own up to that, and take on board that Danes are actually still part of a colonial, not just past but present, and that we need to do some soul searching and inner work there. And when you meet people with this, it can also be, I mean, it's just difficult. You don't want to go there because I feel okay the way I am. I don't really feel like I need to do a lot of soul searching or actually own up to anything, and it wasn't me, it was in the past, and so on. So how do you have any thoughts on that? How do we have that conversation in a way? And I totally respect that sometimes we also just need to say it as it is and cause some upheaval, and things are difficult, and that's not I mean, negative emotions are not bad, but how do we create the sort of space where it doesn't end up just being a negative framing, but actually being, there's healing work going on here, there's important and necessary work.
Absolutely. I think for me, we urgently need to find the higher unions as a planetary species. And at the same time, we need to understand that we will not solve the global problems through global conversations like the UN conference processes on all those issues.
Yeah.
The only way that these results of a misguided worldview of a culture that then exported that worldview to most of humanity in the last 200 years are now playing out through cascading ecosystems collapse and climate change, and even the wealthy countries are beginning to see that this edifice that is built on a culture of extraction is coming to an end. It's a house of cards. As we build all of that energy and material culture on non-renewables, and that means at some point we're running out. And the more of us there are, and the faster we use and consume, the quicker we run out. And we're still, after 50 years of knowing that, not really making fundamental shifts. We're still structurally trapped in a culture of consumption. And yeah, the unlearning bit is really central, that we need to understand that how deeply that worldview that is structurally racist, structurally colonial, structurally extractive, the power over system is running so deep. Even in the ones like you and me who are trying to be different, we still act out that system over and over again with our passports when we can just travel wherever we want so easily, compared to other people who have to stand in long queues, if they're lucky, to just travel around Europe. And I think it is about this worldview shift of understanding that we are part and parcel of life itself. And even the maturity of not, as long as we ask too much, what's the advantage for my company? What's the advantage for our people, our nation? And you don't ask enough, how do we make life as a whole healthy again? How do we heal the damage to the system that we've done? You mentioned that, like my work when I in between 2003 and 2006, I tried to continue the work that I started in 2001-2 at Schumacher College, and wrote a PhD in design that I thought was going to be design for sustainability. And as I was writing it, I realized that the word sustainability doesn't tell us what we're trying to sustain: profits, humanity, life. And in that process, partially through the amazing help of my PhD supervisor, Professor Seaton Baxter, I came across the work of Aaron Antonovsky, who is an Israeli health scientist who in the 1960s, late 1960s, wrote a book called Health, Stress, and Coping, in which he had looked at how on earth could that generation that lived the Holocaust, that was interned in concentration camps, that saw the horror that were those places and survived it, how on earth did they become loving grandfathers, husbands, wives, community members, mayors, and whatever, business entrepreneurs, teachers, professors again afterwards? And so he did a lot of psychological interviewing of people in Israel, and the sense of coherence, the embeddedness in a story that is meaningful beyond your own individual life. Like a story that is powerful enough to say, ultimately, if my life only serves the benefit of life as a whole, I can merge back into the whole and still meaningfully live in that. My continued survival or the continued survival of my species is not dependent on me getting meaning out of participating in the right way in this system. And that, to some extent, I more and more feel that we as humanity are at a strange point in history where we have overdone it to the point that we have no more guarantees, and most likely, or increasingly likely, we will have to face the possibility that learning in the future will be about helping younger generations to cope with the fact that they're living in a terminal civilization, like that they're living, we're the members of a dying species on a possibly dying planet. That's as bad as it could get. Mm-hmm. And I think the only way that we can reverse that in a sort of somewhat paradoxical way is by gaining the maturity of saying, well, if our species dies, how can we live that life itself is more abundant, more diverse, and on its way to healing again when we have to bow out? And if we get that maturity to become caretakers of the future of life itself, irrespective of our own survival, if we can create a powerful narrative that unites us with life to that point, then I think paradoxically, we might actually create the regenerative cultures again that will take us through the eye of the needle and have possibly a reduced number of us enjoy a 23rd and a 24th century. But that's a pretty harsh reading of where we're moving towards.
Right. Well, I mean, I think I'm with you on that. I mean, one of the things, and relating to my previous question as well, is, you know, if you have a culture that is actually fragmented and divided, some people are unaware even of their role in a, you know, colonial past, dominator culture, extractivism, all of these things, you know, and I think that to transform, to any sort of transformation, you have to go through an eye of a needle. You have to go through a point of maybe even nihilism, like in a sort of liminal space or whatever, in the way that anthropology talks about this, that, you know, the old structures break down and then there is this period of uncertainty. Maybe we are in that already as a culture. And then, you know, things will emerge from there in an uncontrollable way. We can't make a 5-step plan for the last phase, because we just don't know what will emerge. We already see now there are, I mean, we're speaking together here in September 2024, when there are these massive floodings going on all over Europe. I mean, I'm lucky enough that it hasn't reached Denmark, but there are new geological phenomena coming into play with, like, you know, the huge earthquake that happened 7 years ago in Greenland. These things, we just don't know what is beyond the horizon. And then at the same time, you know, this thing, a question about the story and the meaning, and that, you know, there are glimmers of other roles that we can have, or that we can as human beings, and the one part of the shift. I mean, there are cultures that already went through the apocalypse. There are cultures that, you know, are living in the aftermath of a collapse, and, you know, what we're seeing from indigenous cultures and indigenous researchers is that, you know, that if we actually want to step into greater coherence, there are so many examples already available to us, and if we open up to that. I mean, I know, for example, that you've spoken with Lila June Johnston, who talks about, you know, the North American cultures, and actually also South American, but well, all over the planet, this has been the case, that you know, human beings, human societies have actually been something like what we in biology call a keystone species, that open up new niches for life and for evolution, for the complexity to continue, and at the same time have been able to harvest food I mean, in Western agriculture, we often put, you know, biodiversity and agriculture as opposites, but there are examples of where this is possible. And if we open up, or if a story is opening up where there is a role for us, for the dominator Western people, the colonizers, the extractors, to step into a different, fundamentally different role, then perhaps there is a different way to go about these things. I mean, this is my own sort of hope, because I share your view on how things are going, in which direction we are headed.
Absolutely. Just to maybe tie both to what I said earlier, like in that process of writing my PhD, and learning about Aaron Antonovsky, who uses this word salutogenesis, health generating, like a salutogenic understanding of health, because we talked about health earlier. That is health not as, here's a system that is in a perfect state, it's healthy, then there's a disease through some kind of vector or accident, the system falls out of this perfect state, has symptoms of disease, we need to fix the symptoms, and then it goes back into that state. That's the allopathic way of thinking of health. That's how our health systems work. The salutogenic understanding of health says, no, health is is nested in and of itself. Health is an emergent property of a complex dynamic system. It happens at this level of the cell, the organ, the individual, the community, the ecosystem, the bioregion, and the planet at the same time. And they're fundamentally interconnected. And so when I wrote my PhD on design for human and planetary health in 2006, people thought the concept of planetary health was nuts. But now there's a Planetary Health Alliance, 280 research institutions, policy-making institutions around the world thinking exactly about this link between ecosystems health and planetary health. And what I believe more and more, our role, like at Lila June's work with this wonderful PhD, if anybody should look it up, if you go Lila June PhD, you'll find it. It's called Architects of Abundance. And in it, she describes how in many places where colonializers have even taken people off the land, but where indigenous people lived prior to that for generations, even 200 years later, those places are more biodiverse, more bioproductive, more healthy than comparable ecosystems at the same latitude, where that human habitation process hasn't happened because it's an island that was never inhabited as a comparison. So that means that, and we know this from North America, from South America. The other non-deniable factor is that the biodiversity hotspots of the planet map one-to-one to indigenous land management practices of that. They are the pockets of where the last indigenous people of this planet were living for the last few hundred years. So we know that our species is capable of what you were saying, of being a regenerative keystone species. But this act is not an act, and this is where we get confused with our education. It's not an act that we can do through a planetary authority and let's heal the planet. We can heal places. And if every culture around the planet re-engages in that process of healing places, then the end result will be healing the planet. The pathway to how do we scale this up is not by making it a bigger project. It's by making it a project that is culturally and context specific in each place around the world. Mm-hmm. But, and this is the important thing, we live in times where that coming back to place, growing roots, regionalizing production and consumption, healing local ecosystems, healing soil series, replanting the forests, cleaning up the rivers. That's the work of our time. That's why we have Common Land and the Ecosystems Restoration Camp and the 1,000 Landscapes process. There are millions of people engaging in that conversation. But we also need to do our anticipation and foresight work and understand that climate change will most likely exacerbate this century of migration that we're in the middle of because of environmental destruction, because of political unrest due to environmental destruction. So how do we create these place-rooted cultures that learn to build community resilience and heal their local context again in such a way that when they've begun to be successful of that, they don't become defensive against a sudden flood of incoming people that weren't as lucky and had uncertainty destroy their ability to do that in their place. And this is something we just need to be aware of as we build these structures. But for me, at the center of our job for the next century is building community resilience in the face of uncertainty by bringing fundamental provisioning of population in place closer to home again, but to do so in ways that actually increase the amount of forest cover, transform our mechanistic agriculture that is high fossil fuel and energy input to an agroforestry system that would provide both ecosystems functions and food for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And wow, the thing with I think one of my own personal experiences in the last sort of decade or so is that actually being more in nature and actually realizing that, you know, there are nature and organisms, all organisms have their own voice. And it's if we spend time with them, even though we don't really know what they're saying, actually slowly we will come into build relationship and actually begin hearing something, and also taking questions with us into nature. We also actually get responses and answers. And
That for me is actually a core methodology of regenerative learning. Again, like if we to just tie a bow to a lot of what we've been talking about, we have these methods that have been handed down through that long lineage that was pre-intellectual and pre-verbal, and or then it became verbal. Like when we were still these regenerative cultures in place, when we were still living, and some of us still are, importantly, in that deeply rooted in place way, we had certain technologies of the sacred, I call them, that are much more powerful technologies than all of our technologies that we're so proud of today, because they're less brittle. All they need is to have a group of human beings with mutual trust and community in the center. And then you can use the way of counsel, sitting around the fire to talk about and what now when things have gone wrong, as a way of collective meaning making and re-establishing the coherence that is so vital for people not to become ill or panic in those situations. So enabling people to work with the way of counsel in a sacred technology kind of way is also on the social side of things the work of this time. And similarly, another set of technologies of the sacred is rites of passage. The marking the different stages in development, so people actively step into that shift from the child and teenager phase, where there is still a receiving from the system in order to grow, to a more mutual relationship where you're an active participant and you serve the system and the system serves you. And that's what every culture had at multiple stages in life, in order to even open up the deeper conversations around how are we obliged to each other and the living planet.
Right.
Wow.
That's beautiful. I mean, that's actually I mean, I have many more questions here, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about them some other time. But for now, I think our time is our hour here has come to an end. But I think that is a really beautiful place to end it. Thank you for
Thank you. Interesting questions.